I never thought I'd be the guy sitting in a cold, dark SUV outside my own house, watching my life evaporate through a high-definition lens. But here we are. You see these stories online all the time, don't you? You scroll past the headlines about betrayal and think, that's crazy, but it would never be me. I thought the same thing. I thought I had built a fortress. I thought Evan and Chloe were the gold standard of what a modern American marriage looked like. We had the sprawling colonial in the suburbs of Virginia, the 2 German shepherds, the careers that kept us busy but comfortable, and a decade of history that I believed was written in stone. But let me tell you something about stone. If you hit it at just the right angle, it doesn't just crack. It shatters into dust. If you're listening to this right now, maybe you're in your car on the way to a job you hate, or maybe you're folding laundry in a house that feels a little too quiet. Wherever you are, just drop a comment and let me know. Sometimes knowing there are other people out there breathing the same air makes the weight on my chest feel a little lighter. And if you've ever felt that sudden sickening pit in your stomach when you realize someone you loved was a stranger, please hit that subscribe button. I'm sharing this because I need to get it out and because I want you to know that the perfect life is often just a very expensive stage set. The cracks started appearing about 6 months ago, though I was too blinded by my own provider ego to see them for what they were. I'm a project manager for a major defense contractor. My days are spent staring at spreadsheets, managing multi-million-dollar budgets, and ensuring that every tiny bolt in a massive machine is exactly where it needs to be. I brought that same energy home. I thought as long as the mortgage was paid, the vacations were booked, and the kitchen was remodeled with that white Carrara marble Chloe wanted, everything was fine. I didn't realize that while I was focusing on the bolts of our life, the foundation was being eaten away by termites. Chloe started talking about finding her center. At first I encouraged it. We live in a world that's constantly screaming at us, and if she needed meditation or exercise to handle the stress of her boutique PR firm, I was all for it. She joined a high-end studio in North Arlington, and suddenly our house was filled with the scent of sandalwood and expensive sage. Then came the name Sebastian. He's not just a trainer, Evan, she told me one night over a glass of Napa Cab that cost more than my first car. He's a healer. He understands energy in a way that's transformative. I should have caught the way her voice trailed off. I should have noticed how she didn't look at me when she said the word transformative, but I just nodded, tucked a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear, and told her I was glad she found something that made her happy. I even suggested he come to the house for private sessions. We had a state-of-the-art home gym that was mostly gathering dust, and I figured it would save her the commute in DC traffic. It was the most expensive mistake of my life. Sebastian arrived a week later in a vintage Land Rover that screamed, "Trust Fund Bohemian." He was exactly what you'd expect, mid-30s, skin tanned to a perfect bronze hair, tied back in a loose bun, and an air of calm that felt manufactured. He shook my hand with a grip that was a little too firm, a little too knowing. He looked me in the eye and said, "You have a lot of stagnant energy, Evan. You should join us sometime." I laughed it off. "I'll stick to my deadlifts and espresso, thanks." For the next 3 months, Sebastian was a fixture in our home. 3 days a week, 2 hours a day. I'd come home from the office and hear the low drone of ambient sitar music coming from the gym. I'd see their silhouettes through the frosted glass doors, Chloe contorted into impossible shapes, Sebastian hovering over her, adjusting her alignment. I trusted her. That's the thing about being a good husband in the suburbs. You're taught that jealousy is a sign of insecurity. You're taught to give your partner space. I gave her so much space that she found room for another man in it. The shift in Chloe was subtle, then surgical. She stopped asking about my day. She started locking her phone face down even when she was just going to the bathroom. The intimacy didn't just fade, it became a chore. When we did touch, it felt like she was performing a duty her mind 1,000 miles away, probably in some candlelit room with the healer. Then came the financial weirdness. It started with small requests. "Evan, I want to move some of our joint savings into a private wealth fund. Sebastian says the market is too volatile, and he has a connection with a boutique firm that handles conscious investments." I'm a numbers guy. I told her it sounded like a scam. We had a huge argument, the kind where she accused me of being controlling and trapped in a toxic masculine mindset of hoarding resources. She cried. She told me I didn't support her growth, and because I loved her and because I was tired, I relented. I signed a few documents. I figured it was her play money. I didn't look closely at the fine print. I didn't see that the wealth fund was a shell company registered in a tax haven. The red flag that finally snapped me out of my trance happened on a Tuesday. I'd forgotten my laptop charger at home, a classic cliché catalyst. I pulled into the driveway at 2 p.m. Sebastian's Land Rover was there, which was normal. But the house was silent. No music, no chanting. I walked in through the mudroom, moving quietly because I didn't want to interrupt their zen. As I approached the gym, I heard voices. They weren't whispering. They were laughing. It was a sharp, jagged sound that didn't belong in a house of healing. He actually signed the power of attorney for the house. That was Sebastian. His voice wasn't calm anymore. It was hungry. He didn't even read it, Chloe replied, and the contempt in her voice sliced through me like a razor. He's so obsessed with being the provider that he thinks buying my silence with a signature makes him a hero. He's a suit Sebastian. A boring, predictable suit. I froze in the hallway. My heart wasn't just beating, it was slamming against my ribs like a trapped animal. I felt the heat rise up my neck, a primal stinging burn. I reached out and touched the wall to steady myself, my fingers grazing a framed photo of us from our honeymoon in Amalfi. We looked so radiant then. So safe. Once the final transfer hits the escrow for the retreat center in Costa Rica, we're gone, Sebastian said. I could hear the sound of a zipper. He'll be left with the mortgage, the dogs, and a mountain of debt he can't explain to the IRS. By the time he figures out the accounts are drained, we'll be off the grid. I almost feel bad for him, Chloe said, but she was giggling. Almost, but I'm tired of playing the suburban housewife. I want the life you promised me. I stood there paralyzed as the reality of the situation settled into my bones. This wasn't just a physical betrayal. This was an assassination. They were planning to strip me of everything, my home, my credit, my reputation, my future. They wanted to leave me standing in an empty house while they lived off my life's work in the tropics. I didn't storm in. Every fiber of my being wanted to kick that door off its hinges and throw that fraud through the window. But my project manager brain, the part of me that handles crises and logistics, kicked in. If I confronted them now, they'd hide the money, they'd pivot, they'd lie their way out of it. I needed more than just a overheard conversation. I needed a cage. I backed away from the door, my shoes silent on the plush hallway carpet. I made it back to the mudroom, slipped out the door, and got into my car. I drove 2 blocks away, pulled over into a church parking lot, and just stared at my trembling hands. The man I was 5 minutes ago was dead. The guy who believed in adjusting alignment and finding your center was gone. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Chloe's contact, then moved to my call history. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I called a man I hadn't spoken to in years, a guy named Brooks, who used to do security work for my company before he went private. He dealt in the kind of information that doesn't show up on a standard background check. Brooks, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I need you to find everything you can on a guy named Sebastian Vance, and I need to know exactly where my money went in the last 48 hours. I sat there for an hour watching the sun start to dip behind the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I realized then that I couldn't go back into that house as the Evan they knew. I had to become an actor. I had to be the boring suit for just a little while longer. I had to let them think they were winning. When I finally pulled back into my driveway at my usual time, 6:30 p.m., the Land Rover was gone. The house looked peaceful. The lights in the kitchen were warm and inviting. Chloe was at the stove stirring something that smelled like garlic and herbs. She looked up and smiled the same smile she had given me for 10 years. "Hey, babe," she said, stepping over to give me a kiss on the cheek. "How was the office?" "You look exhausted." I felt her lips touch my skin, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to recoil. Her touch felt like a burn. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the coldness behind her eyes for the first time. She wasn't my wife. She was a scavenger. "Just a long day," I said, my voice steady, practiced. "Lots of moving parts. You know how it is." "I do," she said, turning back to the stove. "You should try to relax tonight. Maybe some tea. Sebastian left some special herbal blend that's great for stress." I walked past her, heading toward the stairs. I needed to wash the smell of her lie off me. As I reached the landing, I stopped and looked down at her. She was humming a song, something light and airy. She was happy. She was happy because she thought I was a fool. I went into our bedroom, the sanctuary we had built together, and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there in the grey twilight, listening to the muffled sounds of her moving about the kitchen below. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. A text from Brooks had just come through. "Evan, you're not going to believe what I just found. Your healer isn't just a yoga teacher. He's got 3 different aliases and a trail of bankrupt ex-wives from Seattle to Miami. And that wealth fund. It's moving fast. We have to move faster." I stared at the screen until the light dimmed. My eyes drifted to the closet door, which was slightly ajar. Hanging there was the suit I'd worn to our anniversary dinner last month. It looked like a costume now. Everything was a costume. I got up, walked to the closet, and slowly began to pack a small, discreet bag with the essentials not for leaving, but for the war. I tucked a spare burner phone and a digital recorder into the lining. My heart was no longer slamming. It had turned into a cold, rhythmic pulse. The boring suit was gone. I walked back downstairs, the special herbal tea waiting for me on the counter. I picked up the mug, the steam rising into my face, and looked at Chloe. She was checking her phone under the table, a small private smirk playing on her lips. She thought she was watching a man walk toward a cliff. She had no idea I was the one holding the map. I took a sip of the tea, the bitter herbs coating my tongue, and I smiled back at her. "This is perfect, Chloe," I whispered, the porcelain of the mug clicking against my teeth as I set it down with a deliberate, heavy thud on the marble. The ceramic clicked against the stone, a sharp final sound that felt like a gavel striking in a courtroom where I was both the judge and the condemned. Chloe didn't even flinch. She just kept scrolling her thumb, dancing across the screen with a rhythmic ease that made my skin crawl. To her, I was just background noise, the steady hum of a refrigerator or the ticking of a clock she had long ago stopped noticing. She had no idea that the man sitting across from her wasn't the predictable suit she had spent years diminishing. That man had died in the hallway an hour ago. The person inhabiting my skin now was a strategist, a hunter who had realized the trap was already closing and decided to build a bigger one around it. I watched her for a moment, the steam from the tea she'd made, the special blend from her lover, curling between us like a physical manifestation of the lies we were breathing. Every sip felt like swallowing a tiny bit of glass, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. This was the performance of a lifetime. I needed her to believe that I was still the oblivious ATM she'd been using to fund her exit strategy. I needed her to see the same tired, overworked husband who would sign anything just to keep the peace. "Everything okay, Evan?" she asked, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright, fueled by the adrenaline of the secret life she was living right under my nose. "You're being very quiet tonight. Just thinking about the quarterly projections?" I lied, the words coming out as smooth as silk. "The firm is pushing for a new direction. It's a lot of paperwork, a lot of shifting assets. It's draining." A flicker of interest crossed her face, not for my well-being, but for the mention of assets. I saw her posture straighten slightly. "Well, maybe Sebastian is right," she said, her voice dropping into that faux spiritual tone that used to soothe me, but now made me want to scream. "Maybe you need to let go of the attachment to the material. Clear the space for something new." Something new, like a villa in Costa Rica paid for with my sweat and blood. "Maybe you're right, Chloe," I said, forced a weary smile, and stood up. "I think I'll head to the home office. I've got some files to review before the morning." I walked away without looking back, feeling her gaze on my shoulders. As soon as I closed the office door and locked it, the mask slipped. I collapsed into my leather chair, the air leaving my lungs in a jagged shudder. My hands were shaking so violently I had to sit on them to make them stop. I pulled out the burner phone Brooks had dropped off in my mailbox earlier that evening. The screen glowed, illuminating the dark corners of the room. Brooks had been busy. The files he'd sent over weren't just red flags, they were a goddamn parade of them. Sebastian Vance didn't exist 4 years ago. Before that, he was Julian Thorne in Seattle, and before that, Marcus Sterling in Scottsdale. Each time the pattern was identical: find a woman in a high-income marriage, offer spiritual healing or holistic coaching, alienate her from her husband, and then facilitate a massive investment into a shell company before vanishing. He was a professional ghost, and Chloe was his latest haunt. But Chloe wasn't just a victim. That was the part that burned the most. In the recordings, Brooks had managed to snag from the gym's smart home hub, which I had forgotten was even connected to our security system. Chloe wasn't being coerced. She was the architect. She was the one suggesting which accounts to drain first. She was the one laughing about how easy I was to manipulate. I spent the next 6 hours diving into the digital guts of our life. I pulled every bank statement from the last 3 years. I tracked the wealth fund transfers. She had been skimming off the top for months, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, disguised as boutique consulting fees or wellness retreats. It was a slow bleed designed to keep me from noticing until the final fatal blow. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her giggle from the hallway. "He's a boring, predictable suit." The phrase looped in my head like a broken record. I realized then that my revenge couldn't just be legal. It couldn't just be about the money. I needed them to feel the same sudden, violent loss of gravity that I was experiencing. I needed to let them think they were inches away from the finish line before I pulled the earth out from under their feet. The next morning, I was downstairs at 6 a.m., making coffee as if nothing had changed. When Chloe wandered into the kitchen, wrapped in a silk robe I'd bought her for her last birthday, I was already dressed for work. "Early start," she murmured, rubbing her eyes. "Big meeting with the offshore consultants?" I said, pouring her a cup. I made sure my hand didn't shake. "In fact, Chloe, I was thinking about what you said, about the wealth fund. I think I'm ready to move the bulk of the contractor bonuses into that account Sebastian mentioned. If we're going to do this conscious investment thing, let's do it right." I watched the way her entire face lit up. It was sickening, The greed was so naked, so raw, I wondered how I had ever missed it. Really, Evan? That's amazing. Sebastian will be so happy. He says the window for the Costa Rica project is closing fast. We need to secure the deed this week. I'll have the papers ready by Friday, I said. Just tell him to be here at noon. I want to go over the final transfer details with him in person. I want to make sure the energy is right. She actually hugged me. She wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered that she was proud of me. I stood there stiff as a board, smelling her expensive perfume and thinking about the retreat she was planning with another man. The rest of the week was a blur of tactical maneuvers. I met with a forensic accountant in a strip mall office in Alexandria, someone Sebastian's people would never think to look for. We traced the shell company back to a series of virtual offices in the Caymans. I didn't stop the transfers. Instead, I did something much more dangerous. I rerouted the permissions. I made sure that while the money looked like it was moving toward their account, it was actually being flagged by a high-alert fraud system I'd secretly set up with the bank's private security division. I was laying a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led straight to a felony. But I needed the physical evidence. I needed the smoking gun that would prove criminal conspiracy, not just a messy divorce. On Wednesday, I installed a series of pinhole cameras in the home gym. I watched the live feed on my phone from my office cubicle. I saw them together on the yoga mats, their bodies intertwined in a way that had nothing to do with alignment. I watched them toast with my vintage scotch. I heard them talking about the flight to San Jose. He's actually doing it, Chloe said, her voice crackling through the tiny speaker. Friday at noon. He's moving the entire 4 million. I told you, Sebastian said, his voice oily and arrogant. Men like Evan are built to be used. They think their value is in their checkbook. We're just helping him redistribute his wealth to people who actually know how to live. I turned off the screen. My heart was a cold, hard stone in my chest. I didn't feel sadness anymore. I didn't even feel the hot flash of anger. I felt a strange clinical clarity. I was no longer the victim of this story. I was the author of the ending. Friday morning arrived with a heavy gray mist that clung to the trees in our backyard. I told Chloe I was working from home to finalize the signatures. She was giddy, humming to herself as she moved through the house, probably mentally packing her bags. At 11:45 a.m., the Land Rover pulled into the driveway. I met them in the living room. Evan, Sebastian said, extending that firm, fraudulent hand. I'm glad we're doing this. It's a big step toward a more elevated life. It certainly is, Sebastian, I said, shaking his hand. Let's go into the gym. I have the laptop set up there. We walked into the gym. I had the laptop open. Chloe, as the co-signer on the joint account, I need you to enter your secondary PIN here. She didn't hesitate. She typed in the numbers, the date of our wedding, ironically enough. And Sebastian, I need you to sign this digital affidavit of intent. Sebastian scrolled his name across the tablet. As soon as he lifted the pen, the screen turned a deep blood red and a single word appeared: flagged. I reached over and closed the laptop lid. I stood up and straightened my tie. It means, I said, my voice echoing in the mirrored room, that the bank's fraud department just received a signed confession and a digital footprint of a conspiracy to commit grand larceny. From the driveway, the muffled but unmistakable sound of a siren began to wail, blue and red lights starting to pulse against the frosted glass. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the digital recorder, and hit play. The room was filled with the sound of Chloe's voice. He's a boring, predictable suit. We'll be off the grid before he figures out the accounts are drained. Chloe's face went to a sickly, translucent white. Sebastian hissed, You think this stops me? It's your word against ours. I didn't blink. I just watched as the shadows of the first responding officers darkened the frosted glass, their heavy boots thudding against the porch. I reached out and picked up the small, expensive glass of scotch Sebastian had left on the table, the amber liquid swirling. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the burn settle in my throat before I set the glass back down on the very edge of the table, balanced so precariously it looked like it might fall at any moment. The crystal glass teetered on the edge of the mahogany table, a single amber droplet clinging to its rim, vibrating in perfect sync with the heavy thud of footsteps on the porch. I watched it with a detached, clinical fascination. It was a metaphor for my entire life, expensive, fragile, and one heartbeat away from a messy, irreversible end. Chloe's breath was hitching now, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the silence of the gym. She looked like she was trying to swallow a stone. Her eyes darted from the red, flagged screen to the frosted glass doors where the shadows of the police were growing larger, turning into looming giants in the afternoon mist. Evan, please, she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. You don't understand. I was confused. Sebastian, Don't... I said the word cutting through the air like a blade. I didn't even look at her. My gaze remained fixed on Sebastian. The healer was gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he wanted to jump out of his own skin. The arrogance had been replaced by a feral, twitchy energy. He was calculating his exits, measuring the distance to the window, his fingers curling and uncurling at his sides. The front door didn't just open. It was an intrusion. I heard the lock click, the lock I'd purposely left unsecured, and the heavy presence of authority filled my home. Brooks was leading them. He wasn't in uniform, but the way he moved with that quiet, lethal efficiency told you everything you needed to know. Behind him were 2 officers from the Fairfax County PD, their gear jingling with every step. "Evan Brooks," my old friend said, nodding toward me as they entered the gym. He didn't look at the yoga mats or the incense burners. He looked straight at Sebastian. "And you must be Mr. Vance, or should I say Mr. Thorne, or maybe Mr. Sterling." Sebastian didn't move. He just stared, his chest heaving. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a private residence. You have no right to be here." "Actually," I said, stepping forward, my shoes clicking on the hardwood floor, "I invited them, and as the sole owner of this property since the deed transfer you both tried to forge was flagged 48 hours ago, I'm exercising my right to have you removed, in handcuffs." Chloe let out a strangled sob and sank onto one of the benches. She looked small. For 10 years I'd seen her as my partner, my equal, the person I would build a legacy with. Now looking at her crumpled there in her expensive athleisure wear, she just looked like a stranger I had accidentally shared a mortgage with. The betrayal wasn't just that she slept with him, it was that she thought I was so worthless that she could erase me like a typo on a spreadsheet. "Evan, you can't do this!" She wailed, her hands covering her face. "We're married." "Are we, Chloe?" I asked, and for the first time I let a hint of the fire in my gut seep into my voice. Because the woman I married didn't spend her Wednesday afternoons laughing about how easy it was to rob her husband blind. The woman I married didn't plot to leave me with a mountain of debt while she flew to Costa Rica with a career criminal. Brooks stepped towards Sebastian, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Sebastian Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. We've been tracking the shell company you set up in the Caymans. Turns out when you use the same VPN pattern for 3 different investments across 3 different states, the federal boys start to take notice." Sebastian tried to bolt. It was pathetic. He lunged for the side door that led to the garden, but he was a yoga teacher, not an athlete. One of the officers caught him by the collar of his linen shirt, spun him around and slammed him against the mirrored wall. The sound of his face hitting the glass echoed through the room. The mirrors, the ones he used to admire his alignment in, now reflected his utter defeat. As the cuffs ratcheted shut, the metallic clicking sound felt like music to my ears. It was the sound of the world righting itself. Sebastian was shouting now, his voice shrill and ugly, spitting curses that would have made a sailor blush. The mask of Zen hadn't just slipped, it had been incinerated. "You think you won, you boring piece of trash?" Sebastian screamed, his face pressed against the glass. "I still got her. I still took her from you. She hates you. Evan, she's been laughing at you for months." I walked over to him, stopping just inches away. I could smell the sandalwood on him mixed with the sharp acidic scent of fear. I didn't hit him. I didn't yell. I just looked him in the eye and felt nothing. No anger, no jealousy, just a profound sense of relief that the trash was finally being taken out. "You didn't take anything that wasn't already broken, Sebastian," I said quietly. "And as for the money, you might want to check that escrow account one last time before they take your phone away. I didn't just flag the transfer, I reversed it. Every cent you tried to skim is currently being audited by the IRS. You're not going to Costa Rica, you're going to a cell in Virginia. And from what Brooks tells me, they don't do a lot of yoga in the state pen." They let him out, his boots dragging on the floor. The house felt lighter the moment he crossed the threshold, but the heavy part was still sitting on the weight bench, crying into her palms. Chloe looked up as the sirens began to fade down the driveway. Her mascara was running dark streaks, painting her face like war paint. She reached out toward me, her fingers trembling. "Evan, please." "He manipulated me. He told me you didn't love me anymore. He told me you were just using me as an accessory for your career. I was lonely, Evan. I was so lonely." "Lonely people go to therapy, Chloe," I said, turning my back on her to look out the window at the gray, rain-soaked garden. "They don't forge signatures on power of attorney documents. They don't drain 401ks. They don't mock the person who has provided for them for a decade." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice a ghost of itself. I turned back to her. This was the moment I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times, but now that it was here, it felt different. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an amputation. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. I didn't throw it at her. I walked over and set it down on the bench beside her. "Those are the divorce papers," I said. "And a temporary restraining order. Brooks has already changed the codes on the house. Your things are in the garage, all of them. Packed by a professional crew this morning while you were out getting your hair done for your flight." "Evan, no. There's a car waiting at the end of the driveway." I continued, my voice flat and mechanical. "It'll take you to your mother's house. I've already spoken to her. She knows everything, Chloe. I sent her the recordings. I figured she deserved to know why her daughter was suddenly moving back into her spare bedroom." The look on her face was one of pure, unadulterated horror. Chloe's mother was a strict old-school woman who valued reputation above all else. Losing her mother's respect was for Chloe a fate worse than jail. "You're a monster," she hissed, the grief turning into a desperate cornered venom. "No," I said, picking up the digital recorder from the table. "I'm just a guy who finally looked at the numbers and realized they didn't add up. I'm the predictable suit, remember? And the suit always makes sure the books are balanced." I watched her stand up, her legs wobbly. She walked out, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I followed her at a distance, watching as she stepped out into the cold Virginia rain. The black car was there, its headlights cutting through the mist. She didn't look back as she got in. I stood on the porch for a long time. The silence of the neighborhood was deafening. I went back inside and walked through the house. It felt enormous. Every room was a museum of a life that no longer existed. I walked into the kitchen and saw the mug of herbal tea I had sipped earlier. It was cold now. I picked it up and poured the liquid down the sink, watching the dark, bitter tea swirl down the drain. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from the forensic accountant. "Evan, final tally is in. We managed to freeze 92% of the assets before they hit the offshore. You're clear." I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. 92%. I had saved the money. I had saved the house. I had won. So why did I feel like I was standing in the middle of a ruins? I realized then that the revenge wasn't the ending. It was just the demolition. I walked back to the gym and looked at the laptop. I reached out and pressed the power button, watching the screen fade to black. I sat down on the floor, not in a yoga pose, but just sitting my back against the wall. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own wallet. Inside, tucked behind my driver's license, was a single plane ticket. It wasn't for Costa Rica. It was for a small town in Maine where my sister lived, a place where the air was cold and the people were honest. I looked at the ticket for a long time. It was a one-way. I stood up and walked toward the stairs. I didn't turn on the lights. I went into the bedroom, picked up my small bag, and walked back down to the mudroom. I stepped out onto the porch and locked the door behind me. I just walked to my SUV, the gravel crunching under my boots. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. I looked older, but there was a clarity in the eyes. I started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the seat. I didn't look back at the colonial house. I just turned toward the highway, the wipers rhythmic against the glass. I reached over and turned on the radio. It wasn't sitar music, it was a simple driving rock beat. I turned the volume up until the sound filled the cabin, drowning out the lingering echoes of the past. I drove into the night, a long, winding path of fire leading away from the wreckage of the life I thought I knew. The interstate swallowed the glow of my headlights, a concrete river cutting through the darkness of the Virginia countryside. Behind me, the life I had meticulously curated, the marble countertops, the spiritual incense, the woman who laughed at my expense, was shrinking into a collection of blurry red taillights in the rearview mirror. I watched them until they flickered out completely. My hands, once trembling with a victim's rage, were now steady on the steering wheel, gripped with the cold, hard calm of a man who had finally settled his accounts. If you're still with me watching this or listening to this, I want you to take a second and look at the person next to you. Or maybe look at the life you've built. Is it real, or is it just a very expensive cage? Drop a comment below if you've ever had to walk away from everything just to find yourself again. Hit that subscribe button because this is the part where the drama ends and the truth begins. This is the part where the boring suit finally takes off the tie. I drove for 6 hours straight, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt acting as a sort of meditation that Sebastian could never have taught me. My destination wasn't just a town in Maine. It was a memory of who I was before the promotions, before the suburban status games, and before Chloe. I pulled into a rest stop somewhere near the Massachusetts border as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The air was biting a sharp New England chill that felt honest against my skin. I pulled out my phone one last time. I had dozens of missed calls from Chloe's mother. A few frantic texts from Chloe herself ranging from, "How could you do this?" to "Please, Evan, we can talk about this." I didn't delete them, I just archived them. They were artifacts now, relics of a civilization that had collapsed under its own weight. I saw a news notification from a local DC affiliate. Local yoga instructor arrested in connection to multi-state fraud ring. There was a blurred photo of Sebastian Julian being led away. The comments section was already exploding. People were shocked, but I wasn't. I felt a strange detached pity for the next Chloe he would have targeted if I hadn't been a numbers guy. He was a predator, sure, but he only thrived in the shadows of people's insecurities. I had fed that shadow for years by trying to buy Chloe's happiness. The drive through Maine was different. The trees were thicker, the air smelled of salt and pine, and the houses didn't look like they were competing for a magazine cover. I reached my sister's place, a small weathered farmhouse, just as the sun was fully up. She didn't ask questions. She just saw my face, saw the lone bag in my hand, and opened the door. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Evan," she said, handing me a mug of black coffee. No herbal blends, no sandalwood, just caffeine and steam. "I didn't just see one," I told her, looking out at the rugged coastline. "I lived with one for 10 years. The next few months were a blur of legal battles and silence. The divorce moved quickly because I had the leverage. When you catch someone in a criminal conspiracy, the fair distribution of assets conversation becomes very short. She got her personal belongings and a small settlement that would barely cover a year of rent in a city like DC. No alimony, no house, no retreat center. I sold the colonial. I sold the furniture. I gave the money to a charity that helps victims of financial abuse. I didn't want a single cent that was touched by their betrayal. But the real revenge wasn't the money or the jail time for Sebastian. It was the moment I realized I didn't hate her anymore. Hate is an attachment. Hate means you still care enough to want them to suffer. One morning, while walking along the rocky beach in Maine, I realized I felt nothing. She was just a person I used to know, a character in a book I had finished reading. I started working again, but not for the defense contractors. I took a job with a non-profit helping small businesses protect themselves from cyber fraud. It paid half of what I used to make, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't staring at the clock waiting for the day to end. I wasn't providing for a lie. I was building something real. I learned that flexibility isn't about how far you can bend your body on a yoga mat. It's about how much your soul can stretch when the world tries to break you. It's about being able to snap back into a new shape when the old one is destroyed. One evening, about a year later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from a correctional facility in Virginia. I didn't open it. I knew it was Sebastian, probably trying to pull one last spiritual manipulation or asking for a character reference. I walked over to the wood-burning stove in my living room, dropped the envelope into the flames, and watched the paper turn to ash. I sat there for a long time, watching the fire light up the room. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to scare me back when I thought silence meant loneliness. Now I knew better. Silence is where you hear yourself. Silence is where the truth lives. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark Atlantic Ocean. The waves were crashing against the rocks, persistent and powerful. My drama, my betrayal, my brutal revenge. It was all just a drop in that ocean. I felt a sense of peace that no incense or chanting could ever provide. It was the peace of a man who had lost everything and realized that everything was just baggage he didn't need to carry. I reached out and touched the cool glass of the window, feeling the vibration of the wind outside. I wasn't a suit anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was just Evan. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. I turned away from the window, the shadows of the fire dancing on the walls, and walked toward the kitchen to start dinner. The floorboards creaked under my feet, a solid, honest sound in a house that didn't have any hidden cameras, any forged deeds, or any lies. I picked up a simple iron skillet, its weight familiar and grounding in my hand, and felt the cool, steady rhythm of my own heart as I began to prep the meal, the salt air drifting through the screen door and filling the room with the scent of a new beginning.